right, shalom, shalom, everyone. Shalom, shalom. Welcome back. Welcome back. Hope everyone's doing good today on this Saturday morning, on this Shabbat day. And as you can tell by the title, man, we're going to talk about the genetic structure of African American and the transatlantic slave trade, genetic imprint. A lot of people don't, like to talk about the history or the genetic breakdown or the genomic breakdown of African Americans. Everyone always assumes that we come from the same population based off shared experiences, shared phenotypes, etc. And we're just going to go back off the last video we did regarding the history of the slave trade, untold stories. Now we're about to get into some more untold stories or some unlike stories or some unlike truths. All right, so give me 1 second to pull up this presentation. Also, in the chat, I have a PowerPoint presentation of the presentation we'll be going over today if you want to follow along, because I'll be presenting this in a different format today. However, if you want to follow along with the usual way I do it, there is a PowerPoint link in the chat for you all to click on and follow along with. And again, just give me 1 second while I go ahead and get this presentation pulled up. And how's everyone doing today? Is everyone doing good before we get started? Hope everyone's doing fine. Enjoying their Shabbat so far. All right. And like I said on my community post a few days ago, be sure to stay tuned because we have a lot of important information coming out over the next few weeks. Okay, let me see something. For some reason, it's blocking me to be able to present. So give me a second. Let me try to come in and come out and restart it. So just stay here for about 10 seconds. All right, so let's see if we got it working now. They don't want us to bring out this information this morning, so they causing disruptions. Okay, it's still messing up. So let me see. This is what I'm gonna do. I guess I just gotta share the entire screen. Yeah, that's what we'll do. We'll go ahead and share the entire screen and we're gonna get into it. Let me make sure everything good this way. Like that. All right. And again, for everyone who wants to follow along with this presentation, you can simply click the link within the chat and it'll take you to a PowerPoint presentation of this and you can follow along with the sources. So, genetic structure of African Americans, transatlantic slave trade, genetic imprint. The first source we'll be reading from or taking information from today is characterizing the admixed African ancestry of African Americans, and all the sources will be to the bottom left or to the bottom of the page, and everything we're reading from and viewing, such as charts and tables, will be directly from these papers. So I'm not giving my opinion. Also, that's why I linked the PowerPoint presentation with you all so you can follow along. So, African and European ancestry in African Americans. It starts off by saying, it is also clear in Figure 1 that the African Americans lie on a direct line between the European Americans and the West Africans, reflecting their varying levels of admixture between these two ancestral groups. These results were confirmed in the estimation of IA, or individual admixture, by using using the program FRAP, also in Figure 1. The amount of European ancestry shows considerable variation, with an average of 21.9 plus or minus 12% and a range of 0 to 72%. See Table 1. But before we move on, we're going to take a look at Figure 1, and we're going to kind of get an understanding of what it's showing. Again, we have the African Americans right here, highlighted or represented with the purple. We have the Europeans right here highlighted and or represented with the blue. And then we have African groups such as your Mandi represented with the yellow. You have your Yoruba represented with the maroon or red. And we have the Bantu represented with the baby blue. And also we have other African groups down here like the Bakia, the San, and the Mbuti. And what it is showing us is that what African Americans are in between or intermediary between these two African and European groups, as it says right here. All right. So let's continue on. African components. The largest African ancestral contribution comes from the Yoruba, with an average of 47.1 plus or minus 8.7%, range 18% to 64, followed by the Bantu at 14.8% plus or minus 5, with a range of 3 to 28%. And Mandinka at 3.8% plus or minus 4.5%, with a range of 3 to 29%. The contributions from the other three African groups were quite modest, with an average of 1.7% from the Bakia, 0.5 from the Mbuti, and 0.3 from the San. We estimate that on average, nearly 80% of African ancestry in our samples of African American is of African origin. So if we look at this table right here, just to get some understanding, there was about 136 samples, and of those 80 samples, or of those 136 samples, around 80 of them, had African ancestry or ancestors of African origin, right? And even if we analyze this, we see the European ancestry outlined. We see the Mandinka, the Yoruba, the Bantu, and the other three African groups ancestry outlined. And even they have it, distributed between the different U.S. regions of birth. So those birthed in, the west regions of the United States, the southern regions, the Midwest, and also the Southwest. All right, so that's just so you all can get an understanding of this chart. It continues on saying, a careful examination of the African components of ancestry in the African Americans is facilitated by restricting the analysis to those portions of their genomes that are exclusively of African origin. All right, continuing on, same paper. And again, if you want to follow along, click the link that I posted in the chat, and you can follow along via PowerPoint version. Characteristics of DNA. As expected, PCA on our entire sample revealed the greatest genetic differentiation between the U.S. Caucasians and the Africans, with the African Americans intermediate between them, reflecting their recent admixtures between ancestors from Europe and Africa. And that's one thing we have to, understand. And we should understand because we were taught the history of America. We know, unfortunately, that a lot of African slaves were raped or taken advantage of by their masters. And we also had situations of free people of color, dating or having children with people of European descent or European origin. So we've all been taught this history. We just have to put two and two together as far as it goes with the genetic analysis. Our estimate of European individual admixtures in the African Americans was also roughly consistent with prior studies, with an average of 21.9%. All right, so this is saying that according to their studies, it kind of lines up with other studies stating that around 21% of African Americans actually have European ancestry. And, we're not talking about autosomal, or we're not talking about admixture specifically. We're talking about direct paternal ancestry. and even maternal, as it goes on to say here. Prior studies focusing on mtDNA and Y chromosomes have found a greater African and lesser European representation of mtDNA haplotypes compared with Y chromosome haplotypes in Africa, or excuse me, in African Americans, suggesting a greater contribution of African matrilineal descent compared with patrilineal descent. In other words, what they found was on the Y chromosome level, you had more European influence opposed to the mitochondrial chromosome. So, in other words, African Americans descend on their father's side, at a higher rate to Europeans than on your mother's side. For example, Kessler and colleagues estimate that 27.5 to 33.6 of Y chromosomes in African Americans are of European origin, meaning 27.5 to 33.6 of African Americans, people walking around that look like, regular African Americans, regular people of color, they actually descend from Europeans, compared with 9% to 15% of mtDNA haplotypes. All right, meaning that African Americans only have 9 to 15% of them who descend from European women on their matriline or their maternal or their mother's side. In a multiple dimensionary or dimensional scaling analysis, these authors place the African Americans in the middle of these African groups, suggesting origins from multiple African populations. However, they also found that they could not differentiate the Y chromosome distributions of West African and West Central African groups, presumably a major source of of ancestry for African Americans. And that is because a lot of these West African groups, like your Yoruba, your Igbo, your Bantu, your Mandi, your Ewe, your Shanti, they all have the same Y chromosome haplogroup. So that's why it's hard to, tell the difference or pinpoint African American males to direct African populations because they all have the same Y haplogroup. And they are all related. Well, not all, but a lot of them. Majority of the groups that African Americans descend from the slave trade have the same haplogroup. And shalom, shalom, brother Neri, shalom. So let's deal with the DNA or the mtDNA, and we're still dealing with the same paper, characterizing the African ancestry of African Americans. It says another study of mtDNA haplotypes in African Americans and different African populations found that more than 50% of African American mtDNAs exactly match common haplotypes shared among multiple African ethnic groups, whereas 40% match no sequences in the African database they reflected. Fewer than 10% of African American mtDNA haplotypes match exactly to a single African ethnic group. The haplotypes that did match were more often found in ethnic groups of West African or Central West African than East or South African origin. Continuing, it is of interest to compare our African admixture estimates to descriptions of proportional representation of various African groups to the Middle Passage and slave trade occurring in post colonial America. A highly detailed census based on historical records has been documented by several authors. Africans were deported from numerous locations along the broad West African or the west coast of Africa, ranging from Senegal in the far west all the way down to Angola in the southwest. In addition, a smaller number of slaves were taken from the southeast Africa. In terms of numbers, the largest group, approximately 50 to 60%, derived from Central and Southern West Africa and the Bight of Biafra, approximately 10% from Western Africa, 25% to 30%, 25% to 35% from the West Coast in between Midward Coast, Gold Coast, and Bight of Benin, and the remaining 5% from Southeast Africa. These estimates show considerable consistency with our results, which also indicate the largest ancestral component of African Americans to be from Central West Africa, followed by West Africa and Southwest Africa. However, because we did not have groups representative of Southeastern and other parts of Southern Africa, we may have underestimated their ancestral representation among African Americans. It is important to note that considerable migration has occurred among African ethnic groups over the past 3 millennia or more. For example, the two Bantu groups included in our analysis originated from a more Central African location, Nigeria, Cameroon, several millennia ago, making precise geographic localization of African ancestry difficult. This difficulty is also reflected in the close genetic relationship among the various West West Central, and Southwest African groups who also show considerable overlap in terms of mtDNA. So when it comes to, tracing your ancestry, your African ancestry to specific tribes in Africa, that can be really hard because again, like the paper just said, these groups, overlay in terms of haplotypes on the Y chromosome and the mtDNA side, right? So moving on, we're going to be reading from the genetic structure and history of Africans and African Americans. And we're going to read the abstract just to get a little understanding about what we're going to be reading over before we dive into it. So we studied 121 African populations, 4 African American populations, and 60 non-African populations for patterns of variation at 1,327 nuclear, microsatellite, and insertion deletion markers. We identified 14 ancestral population clusters in Africa that correlate with self-described ethnicity and share cultural and or linguistic properties. We observed high levels of mixed ancestry in most populations, reflecting historical migration events across the continent. Our data also provided evidence for shared ancestry among geographically diverse hunter-gatherer populations, such as Khoisan speakers and Pygmies. The ancestry of African Americans is predominantly Niger-Kordofan, or also known as Niger-Congo, also known as West African, right? And they put that at 71%. European, 13%, and other African, 8% populations. Although admixture levels varied considerable among individuals, these studies help tease apart the complex evolutionary history of Africans and African Americans, aiding both anthropological and genetic epidemic studies. So let's get into it. Genetic ancestry of African Americans and CMA populations. African American populations from Chicago, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, North Carolina showed substantial ancestry from the African Niger-Kordofan AAC, most common in Western Africa, means of 0.69 to 0.6 or 0.74, and from European Middle Eastern AAC, means of 0.11 to 0.15. Consistent with prior genetic studies and the history of the slave trade. And again, this is also beginning to line up with the previous paper we just read, where they put 80% of African Americans having African ancestry around, and around 20% of African Americans having European ancestry. It goes on to say we observe very low levels of Native American ancestry, although other U.S. regions may reveal Native American ancestry. Again, we observe very low levels of Native American ancestry, although other U.S. regions may reveal Native American ancestry. So genetic ancestry of African Americans and CMA populations. Supervised structural analysis was used to infer African American ancestry from global training populations, including both Bantu, Lemande, and non-Bantu, Mandinka, Niger-Kordofan speaking populations. These results were generally consistent with the unsupervised structural analysis and demonstrate that most African Americans have high portions of both Bantu and non-Bantu and Niger-Kordofan ancestry, concordant with diasporas originating as far west as Senegambia and as far south as Anatolian, or excuse me, I said as Angolian, excuse me, as Angola and South Africa. And this is why DNA is very important because this kind of stabs the people in the heart who like to say, we were never slaves or we never came from Africa or we're native to America. You get what I'm saying? Because when we take a look at the genetic, landscape of African Americans and compare it to these African populations, we see that these African Americans, actually descend from these various African groups ranging from Senegambia to South Africa. How is that? How is that possible if there was never a slave trade? There was never slave boats, and that black people in America were never slaves. As these black indigenous American people like to put it. But continuing, thus, most African Americans are likely to have mixed ancestry from different regions of Western Africa. This observation, together with the subtle structure observed among Niger-Cordoffian speakers, will make it a challenge to trace the ancestry of African Americans to specific ethnic groups in Africa, unless considerably more markers are used. And I also, found another way to do this, because if you have like people in Nigeria or people in Senegal, taking 23andMe and you're related to them, it'll pop up on your 23andMe, because when I look on my 23andMe, I have a few people that are on the continent of Africa, that have these wildly African names that I share segments with, and who is 23andMe is saying that I'm distant relatives with. So it is possible, to, pinpoint who you can possibly descend from on the African continent. But like they say, it'll just be more things that need to be done. Continuing. Patterns of genetic ancestry of self-reported African Americans. Genome-wide ancestry estimates of African Americans show average proportions of 73.2% African and 24% European and 0.8 Native American ancestry. See Table 1. And that's very important as well, because that's less than 1% of African Americans who actually have quote unquote Native American ancestry. And if we look at this table right here, it basically breaks down what we just read. Genome wide, 73.2% African, 0.8% Native American, and 24% European. The genetic landscape of the U.S. We find systematical differences across states in the U.S. Mean ancestry proportions of self-reported African Americans. See Figure 1 and Table 2, or Table S2. On average, the highest levels of African ancestry are found in Americans or African Americans living in or born in the South, especially South Carolina and Georgia. And it's actually reflected within this table here. We see the highest proportions of African ancestry in places like South Carolina with the darkest blue, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. And even when you put that into context, we know we have, communities in places like South Carolina, Georgia, and even Florida known as the Gullah Geechee. And these groups, keep African, they were able to preserve African tradition and a lot of African languages within their speech. So that's really not, a brain fart or something that you wouldn't put together if you just thought about it. All right. We know that these groups are highly African. We know that these groups were slave ports or places where a lot of slaves were imported to from the Caribbean. So we should expect that the highest proportions of African ancestry would still be in those locations, a few hundred years later. It goes on to say we find lower portions of African ancestry in the Northeast, the Midwest, the Pacific Northwest, and California. The amount of Native American ancestry estimated for African Americans also varies across states in the U.S. More than 5% of African Americans are estimated to carry at least 2% Native American ancestry genome wide. So, hey, 5% of y'all carry 2% of Native American ancestry. African Americans in the West and Southwest, on average, carry higher levels of Native American ancestry, a trend that is largely driven by individuals with less than 2% Native American ancestry. With a lower threshold of 1% Native American ancestry, we estimate that about 22% of Native Americans, or excuse me, we estimate that about 22% of African Americans carry some Native American ancestry. So let's deal with the admixture. Again, we're dealing with the same paper, the genetic structure and history of Africans and African Americans. We use the lengths of segments of European, African, and Native American ancestry to estimate a best fit model of admixture history among these populations for African Americans. We estimate that the initial admixture between Europeans and Native Americans occurred 12 generations ago. And we know that would be consistent with the Europeans coming to America and quote unquote finding America and starting to set up colonies on America's soil. Also followed by subsequent African admixture 6 generations ago, consistent with ad, other admixture inferences methods dating African American admixture. A sex bias in African American ancestry with greater male European and female African contributions has been suggested through mtDNA, Y chromosome, and autosomal studies. On average, across African Americans, we estimate that the X chromosome has 5% increase in African ancestry and 18% reduction in European ancestry relative to genome wide estimates. Through comparison of estimates of X chromosome and genome wide African and European ancestry proportions, we estimate that approximately 5% of 5% of ancestors of African Americans were European females and 19% were European males. Again, we estimate that approximately 5% of ancestors of African Americans were European females and 19% were males. So this is basically saying that the European males had a more dominant admixture influence on the African American population. And of course, we know that could come from things like the slave period and things like that. Now, moving on into the last paper is coming from the genetic ancestry of African Americans, Latinos, and European Americans across the United States. And of course, we're going to read the abstract from this paper to get an understanding of what we're going to be diving into as well for this. It says, over the past 500 years, North America has been the one of imprinting missing of Native Americans. Give me 1 second. Give me 1 second, because I think I'm having a typo. I might have to pull up this PowerPoint for this point because this is messed up. Yeah, this part is messed up. Let me stop sharing my screen. I'm gonna pull the PowerPoint up for this part. Let's finish out this last part because I need to be able to read this correctly. That's definitely mistyped. So let me pull up this PowerPoint presentation. Okay, boom. Got that pulled up. All right, so let's go back into full screen. Go ahead and go back to where we just left off. All right, so here we go. Let me know if y'all can see my screen as well. All right, so I have it pulled up. Starting over, the genetic ancestry of African Americans, Latinos, and European Americans across the United States. We're going to read the abstract right here, and then from there, we're just going to start by reading the highlights. Over the past 500 years, North America has been the site of ongoing mixture of Native Americans, European settlers, and Africans brought largely by the transatlantic slave trade, shaping the early history of what became the United States. We studied the genetic ancestry of 5,269 self described African Americans, 8,666 Latinos, and 148,789 European Americans who are 23andMe customers, and show that the legacy of these historical interactions is visible in the genetic ancestry of present day Americans. So let's go ahead and get into the paper, and we're going to focus on the African Americans. All right, we're going to focus on the African Americans in this specific study. It says previous studies have shown that African Americans in the U.S. typically carry segments of DNA shaped by contributions from peoples of Europe, Africa, and the Americas, with variation in African and European admixture proportions across individuals and differences in groups across parts of the country. More recent studies that utilize high density genotype data provide reliable individual ancestry estimates that illustrate the large variability in African and European ancestry proportions at an individual level, and are able to detect low proportions of Native American ancestry. Continuing, it goes on to say, namely, we find differences between states that were slaveholding and those that were free at the time of the U.S. Civil War. Reflected in these ancestry patterns are migration routes such as the transatlantic slave trade that brought Africans through important southern seaports, as documented online in an American Fact Finder and American Community Survey summary file. The small sample size from some areas of the United States, including parts of the middle or the Midwest and mountain regions, reflect the lower population density of African Americans residing in these regions. Though means estimates of Native American ancestry are low, many African Americans carry detectable levels of Native American ancestry. And just to be clear, this isn't talking about, well, from my understanding and my comprehension, this isn't talking about direct ancestry. This isn't talking about Y chromosomal or mtDNA. I believe this is talking about autosomal or admixture. But as we continue to read through, hopefully it'll come more clear. Consistent with historical narratives and family histories, our estimates suggest that 1 in every 5 African American carry Native American ancestry, a higher rate than we detected in self-reported European Americans. All right. So again, 1 in every 5 African American carry Native American ancestry. An individual that carries more than 1% Native American ancestry can arise from one genealogical Native American ancestor within the last 11 or so generations, or multiple genealogical Native American ancestors. Oklahoma shows the highest proportion of African Americans with substantial Native American ancestry, with more than 14% of African Americans from Oklahoma carrying at least 2% Native American ancestry. So, although, you know, people like to claim that the whole African American population descends from Native Americans, it's fairly minimal. So, like we just read, like if we was to look at 100% of the African American population in Oklahoma, for example, more than 14% of those African Americans would carry at least 2% of Native American ancestry. So, Native American ancestry within the African Americans is pretty minimal. All right, it's pretty minimal, despite the family lore. of everybody either being a Cherokee or Blackfoot, right? Oklahoma was the site of contact between Native Americans and African Americans after the Trail of Tear migration in the 1830s, where black slaves comprised a significant part of the population in the 1860s, and the location of the slave holding 5 civilized tribes. All right. So again, a lot of these African Americans that actually, are in these locations were held or descend from, slaves that were held by the 5 civilized tribes. In contrast, we do not observe higher rates of Native American ancestry in African Americans in Florida, which is potentially notable in light of the known history of Seminole intermarriage with blacks according to the 1860 U.S. Census. And I believe that was it. But before that, I want to go back into the Canva and make sure that was all. All right, give me 1 second. Let me go back to the Canva. Yeah, so that was all. So let me bring this back up. And again, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. We were trying to try out a different platform today, right? Try out a different way of presenting the information today. And in doing that, we had a few typos on the presentation. And you all know we couldn't rock like that, so we had to switch it up. But in conclusion, or in summary, we see that African Americans have African Americans, ranging from 60 to 80%. We see that African Americans have European ancestry as well, ranging from 10 to 30%. And we also see that African Americans have Native American ancestry, ranging from what, 0 to 5%. So again, this presentation is just to shed light on the genetic diversity of African Americans, and show that we all have different ancestry. We all have different histories, and we won't know that if we, are lumping everybody together. We have to do things on the individual level in regards to ancestry. All right. Everybody needs to find out their own genetic background before claiming to be something, right? So what I'll do right now, I'll just chop it up with you all before I get ready and hop off. I'll throw the link in the chat if anybody wants to join in. But while I'm doing that, or waiting for somebody to join in, how's everyone doing in the chat? Hope everyone's well. If anyone has any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to put them in the chat. Now's your time to ask. What I have planned for next week, next Saturday, I have plans to do a video detailing ways for African Americans to trace their ancestry, right, through genealogical records. How to trace your ancestry, how to build out a family tree, all that type of stuff, because there's been a lot of people, and I mean a lot of people, on social medias like Instagram and Facebook reaching out to me, trying to figure out how it is that I trace my ancestry, how it is that I'm able to, trace some of my ancestors back to slave plantations. How am I able to get freedmen records? How am I able to do all this stuff? People want to know, and I'm going to, try my best to give a pretty good breakdown on everything I've done and used to find my ancestry, because I've been able to trace my paternal line all the way back to slave plantations. I've been able to trace my maternal line all the way back to plantations. Even when I go to like my maternal grandfather, I've been able to trace them back to like the 1800s. So it's a lot that you can do, but again, it doesn't happen overnight. I've been doing this for like 2-3 years, visiting different cities, submitting different, research requests at different libraries across, the South regions in Alabama, Virginia, South Carolina. So for those who would like to know how to trace their ancestry and build out their family tree, I recommend you tune in next Saturday because I will give you the blueprint and then I will do a live example of it. You get what I'm saying? So that's coming next weekend. And the weekend after that, I'm going to drop a vlog or documentary, short documentary vlog style video I did of me actually visiting a slave plantation that some of my ancestors were enslaved on. So I'll be dropping that in about 2 weeks. So again, any questions, comments, please drop them. The link's in the chat if anybody wants to come on, say their piece, say anything. If not, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this up, and I will see you all next weekend. Like I said, right? Let's see, man, you BHIs gotta stop being so hateful, man. It's starting to get real cultic. I'm looking on my Instagram, man. Golly, you guys are crazy. All right. So I see no questions, comments, concerns. Again, I'll see you all next Shabbat. Be ready to do some deep diving into how you can trace your family history. If you want to, be able to do it with me live, I suggest you all go ahead and sign up for like websites like Ancestry 23andMe. You know what I'm saying? Get as much family history, as much family lore as you can, because I will be doing a live demonstration next Shabbat. All right. Peace and shalom. Thank you for tuning in.